A History of Southern Missouri and Northern Arkansas by William Monks, published in 1907. If you will grease and butter him, number 29. She declared that she wouldn't swallow old Lincoln, and the commander ordered all persons who refused to take the oath, either men or women, arrested and sent to Little Rock. When she found that she had to take the oath or go to Little Rock, she said to them that if they would grease and butter the oath, she would try to swallow it. Afterwards, she became very intimate with one of the young Federals, married him, and when the command broke up, left the post, left the country, and went with him. The author remained there all that winter, being in active service almost every day, capturing some of the worst men that there were in the country. In a short time after the post was located, the west side of the river was all in the control of the rebels. The rebels began to boast and brag that those northern Yankees could stay around the open field and around cities, but whenever they crossed the river, they would show them just how rebel bullets would fly. Colonel Freeman's headquarters were near the head of Sycamore Creek. They would get on the mountains on each side, as the Yankees knew nothing about mountains, and roll rocks down on them, and what they didn't kill with rocks and bullets would be glad to get back across the river to Batesville. There were no ferry boats on the river. They had all been sunk or run out by the rebels. The weather was very cold. White River froze over solid. The old residents there said it was the first time they ever knew of the river freezing over solid. The ice was so thick that it would hold the weight of horses and wagons. Colonel Livingston ordered lumber hauled and laid the planks flat on the ice. He then sent some men who resided in Nebraska when at home to make a test. They reported that the ice was safe for a command to pass over. The commander at once organized a force, crossed the river on the ice, and took up the line of march for the purpose of attacking Freeman's forces, which were distant about 10 or 12 miles. As soon as the rebel forces found that they were moving up Sycamore Creek in the direction of Freeman's headquarters, they placed men on the hills on each side of the creek, and as soon as the Federal forces came within reach, they opened fire and commenced rolling stones. The commander halted, deployed skirmishers, ordered them to fall back, march on foot, and flank the rebels, while they would continue the march up the creek and attract their attention until they would have them completely flanked, and then close in on them. While the main force moved up the creek slowly under almost continuous fire, all at once a general fire opened up on both sides of the hills. I never before saw rebels running and dodging in all directions, trying to make their escape as they did then. A number of them were killed and wounded, and the others taken prisoners. The remainder got down from the hills wiser men and made a hasty retreat up the creek. Upon the Federal column reaching the headquarters of Freeman, it was so unexpected that he had to retreat, leaving all his camp equipage, his trunk and clothing, and about $5,000 in Confederate money. They retreated in an almost northerly direction. Our force returned to Batesville. The scouts, with a small force of troops, were sent up White River to find where the line of march of the rebels was. They found that they had crossed White River near the mouth of the North Fork and were moving in the direction of Pocahontas. There had been 2 Federal companies detailed and sent out northeast in the direction of Spring River. Freeman's command surrounded them and made prisoners of one of the companies. The other company, commanded by Captain Majors, made a charge on the lines and cut their way through. Reinforcements were at once dispatched in the direction of the moving columns of rebels. In the meantime, the rebels had reached Pocahontas on Black River and had effected a crossing onto the east side of Black River, except the rear guard, which were in their boat about midway of the river when the Federal forces reached the west side of the river. They fired on the parties in the boat, wounded some of them, but they succeeded in reaching the bank and turned their boat loose. A strong line of rebels was drawn up on the east bank of Black River and opened fire on the Federal forces on the west side. After considerable firing, both sides ceased. The rebels appeared to move east. The Federal forces again countermarched and returned to Batesville. The country on the west side of White River was still under the control of a strong force of rebels commanded by Colonel Weatherford and 3 or 4 other Confederate commanders. About 3 weeks after their return, an order was issued for 2 wagon trains with 6 mule teams and a detail of 2 companies to escort it. The train moved out for the purpose of getting corn and other forage about 15 miles distant on White River. After they had arrived at their destination and were loading their wagons, a large force of rebels surrounded them, charged on them, and made prisoners of about half of the escort. The Federal captain, who belonged to one of the 11th Missouri Company, surrendered, handed his pistol about half shot out to a rebel soldier, who turned his own pistol on him and shot him dead. The scouts who escaped capture retreated with all possible haste to Batesville. In the meantime, the rebel forces cut the wagons down, piled them in heaps, and set them on fire, while the mules, with all their gear and breeching on, were put into White River and swam across to the other side. As soon as the news reached headquarters, a force was speedily organized and started on a forced march. Upon reaching the scene of action, the rebels were all safely across on the other side of the river. Harness and wagons were just about completely burned up. No chance of any boats to cross the river, and the river being full, they countermarched and returned to Batesville again. The whole winter was taken up in scouting and fighting small bands of rebels. Sometime in the latter part of the winter, the commissaries and forage were becoming scarce, and the nearest Federal post down White River was at Duval's Bluff. The commander called on the author, who was captain of scouts, for a detail of 2 men who could procure a canoe and try, if possible, to reach Duval's Bluff and inform the Federal authorities there of the conditions of the post. The author detailed a man by the name of Joe Hardy Ware and a man by the name of Simon Mason. They were to procure a canoe and travel in the night, drawing it when daylight came into thick brush, and in that way, if possible, reach the Federal post. They succeeded in reaching the post, and in a short time commissaries and provisions with forage were forwarded up the river on 2 small transports with a number of troops to force its passage up the river. Sometime in the latter part of the winter, the boats reached Batesville and supplied all of the wants and short rations of the soldiers, and again made everything merry and happy.